We are ready to start our session with Mr. Bond. And I would like to invite Josh Sen to come up on stage and take over proceedings.
Got hot in the sun.
Hello. Yeah, it's working. Hello. Yeah. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the inaugural session of Kalam 2015. It's a gorgeous spring day, and we are very lucky the sun is not in our eyes, and we're especially lucky to have with us Mr. Ruskin Bond, who is a living legend. Ruskin has been writing since the age of 16, has been published since the age of 21, am I right?
Since the age of 1? No.
No, 21.
21, right. Thank you.
And it's 60 years, Ruskin, this year?
No, I'm 80 years old, so that's how many years?
60 years of writing. Are you going to?
Thank you. She's cut 10 years off my age, so that's great.
Well, he's been writing for 60 years now, which is a
Yes.
fair bit longer than...
Yes, 75, 76, right about that, no? 60s.
Oh.
I must tell you this, Jash here is a mathematician, and the organizers of this event, knowing full well that I could never pass in mathematics at school, decided to have a mathematician handle me and deal with me and interrogate me over here.
We are not monsters, Mr. Bond. We are merely small-time villains. Anyway, but just to give you an idea behind the humor, there's a Sahitya Academy Award in 1992 for Our Trees Still Grow in Dhera. There's a Padma Shri in 1999. And last year, Ruskin was awarded the Padma Bhushan. So, yes, don't be fooled by the jokes. We have an hour with Ruskin. What I propose to do is not take very long asking questions. I'll ask a few of my own. I'll ask a few that have come into me via the Twitter feed and via Facebook from several places across the world. And then I shall throw the floor open to the audience. I mean, I have pages and pages of questions, but I don't want to be the only one asking them. Okay, so shall we start? Shall we?
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah. Thank you.
So Ruskin, you've been writing since you were very, very young. And it looks like you made your mind up to be a writer when you were in your early 20s. Now, most people I've met in my early 20s, and many of the young people out here who are here in droves to see you, we really didn't know what we wanted at that age. How did you have that clarity? How did you know that early on?
Well, in fact, I wanted to be a writer well before I was 20. During my school days, I was quite a bookworm. We had a good library in the school I went to, and I really immersed myself in books. And by the time I'd finished school, I was quite clear in my mind that I wanted to be a writer. I came home after finishing school, 1950, and my mother said, "Now, Ruskin, what do you want to do with yourself? What are you going to do in life?" And I said, "Mom, I think I'm going to be a writer." And she said, "Don't be silly, go join the army." In those days, almost every second boy would go straight into the army. And sadly, that isn't so, because actually the army is a great career. And many of my friends did go into the army. But had I been so, you'd have had probably one more Beetle Bailey in the ranks. So I think the army was probably much better off without me. And in fact, my very first book was probably written when I was a schoolboy. It was a short novel, and I made the mistake, though, of putting my teachers and school staff into it and writing funny things about them. And it got into the hands of my class master, who in those days you got flogged for anything, any misdemeanor. So I was punished, and he tore up my exercise book in which I had written this masterpiece. And that was the end of my first book. So if you're going to start writing at a very young age or at school, make sure you don't put your teachers in it. Huh? That's all.
Now, you've also written about a number of your family members. And looking at the stories, well, they sound pretty eccentric. But do you have a personal favorite among them?
Well, to tell you the truth, when I run out of ideas or stories, I fall back on uncles and aunts and even fictitious relatives, or I make them up. And two, three of them are based on real people. But as time goes by, I invent stories and fictionalize them. And when I run out of relatives, then I write ghost stories. You can always cook up a ghost or two. So these are tricks that an author resorts to over a period of years whenever he sort of runs out of creative imagination. So you're right, a lot of my characters are based on real people, as indeed are most authors, if they're honest, will tell you that many of the people they write about, their characters, even fictional ones, are drawn from real life. And that's often the case with many great writers over the years. You do draw on your own life to a great extent.
So, Uncle Ken really existed?
Uncle Ken did exist, but this uncle who was always getting into trouble and taking me along with him. But as time went on and the stories were popular, and then I had to make up stories about him because, after all, I'm often accused of being a liar, but then a fiction writer is basically a liar, and you have to invent things as you go along.
I'm going to ask you one of the internet feed questions. This is from Amit, whose parents are from Dehradun, and who himself has grown up in Pune, which, he's my age, so it would have been a very hilly town, a quiet colonial town at the time. And he identifies with your writing hugely and wants to know what makes your writing so very visual. He said, he would take his summer vacations in Dehradun and come back with your books and just read them in Pune, and he was in Dehradun again.
Well, he's right. My writing is very visual. And I think because I grew up perhaps being very conscious of the natural world around me, so I always took an interest in trees and plants and birds and wildlife and basically people, because you can't write stories without an interest in people. And of course, places change, and I hope Amit, on his visits to Dehradun, isn't too disappointed, because from being a small garden town 50 years back, it's now a busy mini city full of traffic congestion and all the things that go with a growing city. So he might be a little disappointed or disillusioned, but if you're in a city, the better ones, and like Kolkata, have got beautiful gardens and parks where you can get away from the hubbub. And so I would recommend him and others who live in urban areas to look for the greenery around them, because it's there if you look for it.
It's strange how many people from these slightly hilly towns have identified and they've written to me. I have a second one here that I picked out of a set of 3 or 4, and this is from Bharat, who's an old Bangalorean and now lives in California. And he says, way back when, you wrote a weekly column for the Deccan Herald, and you always reminded him of a milieu that was unhurried, that was innocent, and he wonders what you feel about all the changes around us, especially in the hills. So, very similar to the earlier question.
Well, change has to come. We can't avoid it. We must make the most of it, but try our best to preserve what is good, what's good from the past, and enjoy that too. The Deccan Herald is a paper I used to write for back in the 50s, 60s. You see, when I set out as a writer in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, publishing in India was in its infancy. There were very few book publishers around. And, but I wanted to write, and I wanted to make a living from writing. So I would really write for almost every newspaper or magazine in the land, which took in the Deccan Herald of Bangalore, Sport and Pastime of Chennai, and in Kolkata you had the Amrita Bazaar Patrika, you had the Hindustan Standard. These have gone now, and the Tribune of Ambala, and so many magazines and newspapers in those days actually did publish stories, essays, poetry. So a writer did have a platform. Now the magazines and the newspapers don't really have a literary platform, or if they do, a very limited one. So writers have to look for publishers, book publishers. Fortunately, the publishing industry has grown, and I know many publishers who are doing very well. And the very fact that some of them can actually give me my royalties means they're doing well. Whereas 20, 30 years back, I would have to send frequent reminders to publishers, asking them if they had any money for me. And in fact, there was one publisher I remember about 30 years back in Delhi, and whenever I sent him a reminder for my royalties, he'd get himself admitted into the All India Medical Institute with heart. We used to get a heart attack every time an author asked him for money. So publishing has, I think, changed over the years. You can, I think, reasonably expect that you will get something for your work. Although when I see the number of vanity publishers that have sprung up and are taking large sums of money from aspiring young kids who want to see their name on a book, I'm not sure if they're doing a service to literature. But still, I would never discourage anyone from writing. I would just say that don't be in too much of a hurry to look for fame and fortune. You know, all glory does come from beginning, but you have to continue too. And so sometimes a dramatic beginning may end in disappointment if you don't have the perseverance to continue through disappointments and low periods.
Well, this almost dovetails into the next question I wanted to ask you. Writing is something a lot of parents now encourage their children to do, which is wonderful. What I find, however, is that a lot of parents feel that it is something that children can be pushed into or taught, or it's like biology or, well, your dreaded subject, mathematics, or something to be put under a lens, examined, measured, and, calibrated. Now, does writing actually work like that? And I grew up, in an atmosphere of people quite happily leaving me alone to read or to write or whatever. And that was actually easier for me, but is it different now? What do you feel?
Well, I think it's very important that young people should write well and have a good command over language. in whatever language they're going to use throughout life. They don't necessarily have to become famous writers or make a living from literature, but after all, you can have a scientist who wants to write a treatise, a doctor who wants to write a medical book, a businessman who wants to conduct his business globally or internationally, and a good command of the language, whether it's English or whatever language you're going to use, gives you such an advantage. So I think it is important for youngsters and kids to give importance to their mastery of the language they're going to use, to write fluently, to write with individuality, and if at the same time they can be creative and write stories and books, that's great. But even otherwise, there's nothing like having a good command of language, because that will help you in whatever career you choose to follow.
So, interestingly,